I don't know if this is working. Okay, hi everybody. We're gonna get started. I'm gonna begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And today I'm really excited to announce today's speaker. Dr. David McMillon is an assistant professor of economics at Emory University, where he teaches a class that he designed called The Economics of Systemic Racism. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago at the Harris School of Public Policy, where we met, and we even have friends from Chicago visiting, so it's really exciting. And he holds master's degrees, plural, okay, what, from the University of Michigan in applied mathematics and in industrial operations engineering. The goal of his work can be summarized as harnessing features of complex systems to effectively turn the mechanics of systemic discrimination against itself. I'm happy to know what that means. And I'm excited to hear your talk. So, yay.
Oh, much better now? Okay, I'll just keep going. I'll just keep going. Yeah, so it's the point that I'm making here is that it's often much easier to cause a problem than it is to rectify its initial effects. And that is a consequence of the fact that we live in a world governed by what are called complex systems. Systems that are governed by intense interconnections, where cause is rarely proportional to effect, and really dramatic changes often result in really small effects that fade quickly, and sometimes really small changes in the right place at the right time can have massive effects, effects that carry on well beyond the lifetime of the actual stimulus. And so, uh, thinking about uh, thinking about complex systems theory, I look at charts like this and see that there are all of these, there are disparities in many health outcomes. One of them is disease. I used to have conversations with my grandfather, who was beat up on a chain gang back in the 40s. He was no stranger to racism, but he noticed that many years after Jim Crow, we just continue to see these disparities in many, many, many outcomes. Why is that? Okay. It was racism, he knew, but it wasn't simply racism. There was something more. He was also a military veteran, and he was no stranger to like conservative ideas either. He would think, okay, yeah, maybe there's some issue with personal responsibility. You can talk about that, but in his mind, those are sort of two sides of the same coin. The idea that there's just this massive ongoing racism versus this massive ongoing problem with personal responsibility. Both of those things are suggesting that there has to be some ongoing stimulus in order to see persistent disparities. But if you believe in complex systems theory, that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so we see gaps like in heart disease, we see racial gaps in the wealth in wealth inequality. We've seen very little progress in terms of the racial wealth gap in the the last 70 years or so. Okay, why is that? Is it necessarily the case that you need ongoing persistent racism for that to be the case? What about the achievement gap, the math achievement gap? I could put up so many charts up here, right? We could talk about, some of the things that you guys study, like there are differences in access to clean air. There are racial gaps, in labor market outcomes and so on. Gaps. And so what I think is really important here is that there is a system. And my grandpa used to say that. He literally would say, there's a system that's set up that reproduces these inequalities. And he couldn't tell me what the system was. He just knew that it was. And so what I'm doing here is I'm trying to think of ways to use the theory of complex systems based on my training to establish a notion of systemic discrimination that on one hand allows us to understand why racial disparities would persist. The discriminatory stimulus has faded away on one hand, but also importantly, how to reverse that, okay? And so I define systemic discrimination as a phenomenon in which the injustices are amplified by the properties of complex systems. This will have to do with the fact that everything is connected, okay? We're talking about feedback loops, dynamic complementarities. For example, if I get fired tomorrow from my job because of my race, that won't just impact me. That will impact everyone who's connected with me, everyone who was relying on me for information about my industry. It won't just impact my labor market outcomes today, but it could have feedback effects downstream on future labor market outcomes, and make me more vulnerable to a health shock. Suppose I get injured while I'm unemployed. Now, the discriminatory effect that I face in the labor market is carrying over because it's amplifying my vulnerability to systemic risk. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking about here. Inequities persist, evolve, and can be dismantled by leveraging the very properties of the systems that sustain them. When you are encountering some inequity, which are the effects of injustices, when you encounter some inequity and a mechanism that appears to be amplifying its lifetime, you have two policy alternatives. On one hand, you can disrupt the mechanism that's amplifying the lifetime of the inequity, or you can exploit it because the very mechanisms that amplify the lifetime of inequity can be harnessed to instead amplify the lifetime of equity-focused interventions. So that's the key insight for this framework. And it leads to a clear framework for advancing the literature on the persistence and fade out of policy interventions as well. So it has many policy implications, and I forgot to start my timer, so this is just going to be for that. All right. So that's the plan for this talk, to get into the generalized model of systemic discrimination that I'm claiming can be very useful, even in a practical sense, once we get the mathematical details. I'll go through some depending on how much time we have. Okay, so here's how the model works. First, clarifying some vocabulary. I am not talking about, when I say inequity, I'm not talking about the fact that I'm less likely to get skin cancer because I have melanin. I'm not talking about inequalities that are not really plausibly avoidable. I'm talking about inequalities that are the result of an injustice. I'm really thinking about the causal effect of some particular injustice. So I'm sidestepping, for instance, like Thomas Sowell. I'm not thinking about inequalities that are due to something besides an injustice. So the theory of systemic discrimination is about inequities. Also in this model, I'll be using terms like disadvantaged group and advantaged group. The disadvantaged group is the group against whom the injustice has been carried out. The advantaged group is not necessarily the group who carried out the injustice. Okay, so this allows us, for instance, to define an inequity between someone against whom Jim Crow was carried out, with someone against whom Jim Crow was not carried out, even if they didn't actually carry out the injustice. Okay, inequities are also going to be measured based on standardized between an endowment of a member of a disadvantaged group and the advantaged group's mean. Basically, what I mean here is that whenever you see an inequity in this model, if it's positive, that's like a bad thing. That means that there is more inequity faced by the disadvantaged group relative to the advantaged. I'll try not to spend too much. So here's the intuition for the setup. So the point, temporary and can have effects that last longer than they're supposed to, if I had to summarize it in one sentence. And so in the setup, there's going to be just one exogenous injustice, and then there's no more injustice after that. And we just want to know what happens. Right? Worlds we'll be thinking about. And there's some kind of natural decay process, okay, that occurs for the initial effects of the injustice. Suppose the Tulsa massacre happens, and right after that, there's no other unjust acts that occur. You might expect the resulting wealth inequities to, you might expect that they shouldn't fade away like in the next month or in the next second. But after some reasonable amount of time, you might have some intuition, well, that the effect should fade, at least relatively quickly. But in another world, there could be even race neutral mechanisms that cause the effects of the Tulsa massacre to extend beyond that baseline that you had in your head. Okay, so that's sort of the way that the model is going to work. I'm going to be dealing with the matrix. The matrix has n rows and m columns. Each row is going to correspond to either an individual or a family dynasty. Each column is going to correspond to different endowments. For example, we might care about the effects of an injustice on educational outcomes. That's one column. Maybe we care about its effects on wealth. That's another column. In research, we usually just choose one of these things and zero in on that. That's not what this paper is doing. This paper is thinking about a full spectrum of measures of well-being and how those things evolve over time in response to one instance of injustice. Does that make sense? So here's that, okay? I basically just described this. Here's the math that describes that. X of t is a random matrix with n rows and m columns. And when I say it's a random matrix, I mean that, so it's indexed by time, so it's a sequence of matrices. And every year or generation, a given person or family dynasty faces some shock. For one generation, maybe it's COVID. For another generation, it's World War II and so on. But the point is, this shock, it gets applied to every one of these outcomes of interest for every person or family dynasty. But there's a delta here that's very important. Can you see this? Yes. All right, this delta is doing some important work. The delta is between 0 and 1, and it captures the idea, let enough time go by. You know, if there's no other instances of racism or discrimination, these things ought to fade over time, okay? And this is what's called an AR1 process, and it can be shown that in the long run, you will get this process to decay such that all the entries in the matrix are 0, meaning we have equity, okay, in the long run. This is then used to define systemic discrimination. Relative to that baseline process, systemic discrimination occurs when there exists a function S that takes this process under which the effects of injustices should decay relatively quickly, and it spits out a process under which they're taking longer in order to fade out over time. That's really what all this math says. And the paper is about constructing S. What are the things that live in S? What are all the different reasons that may not be directly due to someone's intent or racism per se? What are the different reasons that a temporary injustice would have effects that last much longer than maybe we feel like they're supposed to? And once we figure out what those things are, the payoff is that we're actually going to be able to exploit them when we design equity-focused interventions. Does that make sense? So also, as an economist, you can just interrupt me as rudely as you want. It makes me feel better because then I feel like people are getting what I'm saying. So anyway, but it's up to you, but I'm very open to interruptions. I certainly am not saying that. I agree with you to be skeptical about that setup. what this is supposed to contribute is, so the point is not to assume that in the real world that actual discrimination will stop, but it's to pivot the conversation in a way that moves solutions. And here's why. I expect personally that discrimination will keep happening. The point here is every time it happens, the way we number one, because we only look at one outcome or one person, so on. But on the flip side of that, the same might be true of our equity-focused interventions. We may not be accounting for all of the different interconnections between people and outcomes and so on. And so there might be a way to strategically design interventions to exploit those interconnections beyond some tipping point such that they have, positive and also permanent effects, right? So not at all to actually assert that discrimination itself will go away, but I'm not focused on discrimination here. I'm focused on its effects. What can we do about its effects? And you'll see more about what I mean as we continue. You can let me know if I answered it. So, for example, Elora Derenoncourt, brilliant economist at Princeton, showed that even under perfectly optimistic conditions, the racial wealth gap will take more than 200 years to close. And even then, that's like within 95% or so. It actually never closes in her model because there's a positive capital gains rate. Literally, wealth leads to more wealth. If that's true, and you had chattel slavery, you can't catch up, not without reparations. That's part of her point. Part of my point here is that if you do implement something like reparations, the fact that there's a positive capital gains rate now becomes an asset to ensuring that the effect of that equity-focused intervention has persistent effects, if that makes sense. Okay. So let me keep going. So what is S, this abstract function that I made up, right? That is, I'm proposing the system. It can endogenize all kinds of different models of interest, all kinds of behavioral models and education, all kinds of different economic models of intergenerational mobility. S is an abstract function that, again, takes us from a random process that would fade over time if there were no other discriminatory acts into a process such that this initial discriminatory act had very long-term, extended persistent effects. What are the different ways it does that? There are 4 ways I'm proposing. And you actually already know all these things. I'm just formalizing. Intersectoral spillover, where one outcome spills over into another. If I experience racism in front of a judge, that doesn't just impact my incarceration outcomes, but of course that will impact my ability to get a job later on. Intersectoral spillover, that's it. Intersectoral synergy. This is really important, I think, especially for an environmental focused audience, because you deal with environmental shocks, right, all the time. And it turns out environmental shocks disproportionately, oftentimes, affect certain groups. Why is that? Some of that is because there are certain variables along which there exist pre-existing inequities. And those pre-existing inequities interact in a synergistic way with the actual shock. So it increases systemic risk against those things. Yeah, please. Yes, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Here's the difference. They're actually very different, but it's subtle. With, for instance, the Flint water crisis, there's a switch. I'm from Michigan, so that was an intense thing for me to see. There's a switch in the water supply, right? And so that exposes people to lead. But then, because for race neutral reasons, because of how the brain works, because of biology, that then also ends up spilling over into educational outcomes, right? So an injustice you experience in one outcome spills over into another. Intersectoral synergy is more subtle. It's how a pre-existing inequity interacts with a shock, okay? And so the shock was not, Hurricane Katrina was not racist, right? COVID-19 was not racist. But because there were unresolved disparities in heart disease that could be due to racism, you saw like disproportionately many Black people die from COVID-19. Does that make sense? So it's subtle, but it's important. Social multipliers, this one is much easier to understand. Literally, people are connected. So what happens to you affects me. That's super obvious in the context of like disease and epidemiology, but it also matters a lot when we study wealth. There could be threshold effects where by, if you, for instance, in my work on reparations, um, um, basically, if an entire community gets access to more wealth, then that there could be a tipping point where it's much more difficult for each individual person to lose their wealth because they have people that they can rely on. So, okay. And then finally, reinforcement processes. These are just feedback loops. And if there's time, which I now feel like there won't be, but if there's time, I'll tell you about this paper I'm more excited about. Where I was able to show, police get sent to certain neighborhoods based on prior arrests. And so that leads to a feedback loop. There was a disruption of that during the stop and frisk era. And that disruption actually improved equity and efficiency. So anyway, that's the point here. So here are all these different ways that a temporary injustice can have longer term effects. And when you deal with those kinds of situations, you have two options in terms of policy. You can either disrupt the amplification mechanism itself, in which case the effects of the temporary injustice no longer amplify over time, or you can exploit the amplification mechanism and rectify the initial inequity and sort of exploit this amplifier like a sort of booster engine. All right, let's see. All right, I'm just going to try to move forward into applications. So I'm going to go through each one of those amplifying mechanisms, and I'm going to try to convince you, how important they can be across different applications. Okay. So I'm going to start with lending discrimination and vulnerability to environmental shocks, which I hope you'll be interested in. And this could have to do, it doesn't even have to be lending discrimination, but any sort of discriminatory bias that exists that imposes a wealth inequity. And so I have a model here that I'm not getting into too much detail with, but basically there's some lending bias. So there are 3 periods. In the first period, one particular group faces disproportionately much lending bias, which induces an initial wealth inequity relative to the other group. In the second time period, we resolve the actual bias itself. So the bias goes away. However, the wealth gap is still there. And then finally, at time equals 2, an environmental disaster occurs. Okay, so there's evidence that low wealth actually makes it much harder to recover from disasters. And there's empirical evidence that you see more wealth divergence after disasters. Damon Jones and Peter Ganong also have a paper showing that something like this happened in the 2008 housing crisis, where poorer Black households had a much more difficult time recovering. Now, some of that could be due to a lack of access to insurance against these kinds of shocks. And so what's really important here, though, is that there's like a ghost effect. There's when you've already experienced sort of a discriminatory act that harmed your wealth, that then sends echoes throughout other kinds of outcomes. In this case, what it does is it amplifies your vulnerability to systemic risk. Okay, and so with a this is not database, but it's a simulation based on the model I just described. As the bias that you had to face, even though it's now gone, as the historical bias you had to face increases, then there's a greater and greater gap in terms of the actual wealth loss from that shock, in particular your ability to recover from it. And so what's really important here is the second chart. So like I said, one reason that this could be the case is because there's a lack of access to insurance in order to recover from economic loss from these shocks. And so I told you when you're dealing with these amplifiers, you can either disrupt or exploit, right? And so what would a disruption look like? Disrupting this relationship would look like making sure poorer households are already insured against environmental catastrophes. And you can see the more that we engage in that kind of insurance, then the less of an effect of the initial lending bias has on the actual wealth loss. And so the disruption is happening in this way, where the dotted line is like full disruption. So that's one approach. Another approach is exploit. Okay, so we have this wealth gap that came from this initial lending bias. What happens if we close the wealth gap? Again, in this case, I'm talking about reparations. So one thing that something like reparations does, it doesn't just it's not necessarily just a moral argument. It's not just something, where you're trying to correct something that was a moral harm in the past. It has benefits that we might miss. In this case, it increases safety from systemic risk. In this case, environmental catastrophes. So that's like one particular thing. Okay, how am I doing on time? 5 from the 30-minute. Gotcha. Okay, I think I'm okay. So thinking about social multipliers, again, this is the fact that people are connected, and I'll go through this one relatively quickly. Let's talk about clean energy adoption, right? Which is something that can happen through social interaction, right? Information spreads, and adopters share information about installers, financing, incentives, and so on. Now, suppose the first group, Group A, the more advantaged group, right, has greater access to clean energy initially, again, because of some earlier stage discrimination, this discriminatory act. So even if we get rid of the discriminatory actors after that, it really matters whether there exists homophily, right? Homophily being, in this case, basically segregation. So people, in plain terms, white people only tend to tell their white friends about whatever the clean energy adoption situation was. So if that's the case, the more homophily there is, what that does is it extends the lifetime of the effects of the initial injustice. Okay, and that's what's happening here. I guess it came out pretty light. I don't know if you can see these other lines. If homophily is 0, if we were to totally disrupt the segregation, then by the next time period, we get right down to equality, where there's an equal share of people of the different who are on the other is, the more segregation there is, what this is doing, it's not that the homophily itself, maybe it's due to racism, but maybe these are just people you're more culturally familiar with, it is. But if there's more homophily, that extends the lifetime of the effects of the initial bias. Okay, so that's the sense in which, again, that belongs in that S function that I'm talking about. So you can actually, again, with the reparative reform, that closes the initial gap that we were talking about. In this case, I'm again talking about wealth, but this is a sense in which we can exploit the fact that there is homophily, and if we increase the amount of wealth that the disadvantaged group is holding, then it's easier for them to quickly engage in the clean energy adoption. Okay, so then finally, I'll just ignore that because I need to move forward. Application 3 will spill over. All right, so this one is going to be, so this is where one outcome spills over into another. But what I'm going to describe is basically my perception of the Flint water crisis. So there's going to be a 3-step decision process, and the decision nodes are going to be interconnected. So in the first stage, there is a water authority who decides who will have access to like clean water, like through the Detroit River or through the Flint River. Okay, that's a decision that's made on some level with direct discriminatory bias, represented by WB. Children then either get exposed or don't get exposed to lead, and then they enroll in school where their teachers, principals, and so on may or may not have some amount of bias described by that E sub B. And later on, it's possible that they'll interact with the criminal justice system where they may appear in front of a judge and deal with bias JB. The way a lot of people think about systemic discrimination is that it's just discrimination that's all over the place. It's just widespread, okay? And it's in the environmental decisions, it's in the schools, and it's in the criminal system. What I hope to convince you of, good enough, and that you might in the total inequity system, if you near viewpoint. The important here, these decisions, it's not just it's that the decisions are interconnected, and the interconnectedness itself enormous. We'll find to the two-stage system, where we're looking at the water-related decision and the school-related decisions that affect the model that I didn't really. If you decision and you research folks, you know, situation naively just decide, well, we just need to sum up the total inequity in the system. So you might actually be underestimating the total inequity because that decision that they made to switch the water over also contributed to the total educational disparity, which won't be picked up if you're just trying to understand the causal effect of a particular teacher or principal on students' outcomes. You can actually back out a direct component and a systemic component. And oftentimes the systemic component might actually be larger. Finally, what's also important is there are conditions under which even if the water authority decision maker is not nearly as biased as the next stage decision maker, like in schools, it's still more optimal and effective to intervene on the first decision maker because they make decisions that impact whether basically in this context, of course, lead affects your cognitive ability in the first place, right? That's what the big point is. The greater the extent to which that's true, the more this is likely to be true. And so this is more of a reason to really focus more resources on dealing with the environmental issues that can affect kids very early in life, just purely for mathematical reasons. Oh boy, there you go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that's the intuition. It generalizes to the three-stage case, right? I said that, you know, there's a water authority, there's a school decision maker, and then there's like a judge, right? So we go through life and we go through, you know, different people make decisions about our outcomes. The point is that each decision maker can have a bias, but the decision nodes themselves are interconnected. And so what that means, I have like a Rubik's Cube here. What is this? This is a three-dimensional sketch basically of how the bias from each of these decision makers determines who you should intervene on first. Should I? It's a school system. The more the region within which it makes sense to deal with the earlier decision makers first expands. And so that red region right there, that's the water authority decision, right? So there's a huge region where the water authority decision maker can be not nearly as biased as the education decision maker or as the judge and so on. And still the total inequity in the system is decreased the fastest if you focus on that person. Okay. So now, and then this generalizes, by the way, to the n-dimensional case, which I don't have to talk about. But okay, finally, this is the last thing. Application for reinforcement processes. These are just feedback loops, basically, right? So if I face, actually, I'll just get right into it. The police, as I said before, the police, you know, they police certain neighborhoods, and because they've historically policed certain neighborhoods, there are discovered crimes in those neighborhoods that then get recorded, thus justifying police deployment in those same neighborhoods. At the same time, it's possible that there is crime that could be discovered in other neighborhoods that they're not actively policing. But because that doesn't really get fed into their mental algorithms, then they're less likely to visit those same neighborhoods. Nowadays, with the advent of AI, this is getting worse. I may have another paper on that coming at some point, depending on my co-author, but Even in the context of stop and frisk, before AI really started being used in police departments, everyone is engaging in algorithmic decision making. You don't need an AI tool to do that. And so what I can show, what I have shown, is not only theoretically, but even empirically, that the disruption of the stop and frisk era led to a situation proved both fairness and efficiency. Okay, so stop and frisk sharply decreased it made it more difficult for police to keep on getting sent to the same neighborhoods because of the underlying arrest incidents. Arrest incidents actually declined sharply, and also the false positive stop burden significantly decreased, disproportionately for minority, Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And one more thing that I want to say, there's this result in algorithmic fairness that basically says, it's called an impossibility theorem. So you can't equalize false positive rates, true positive rates, and what's called positive predictive value, all at the same time when the underlying arrest rates are different across groups. What I showed here, empirically and theoretically, is that when we disrupted stop and frisk, we were actually able to close the gap, the arrest gap that constrains that impossibility. And so that's why we're able to improve both equity and efficiency. And I don't even know how well you can see. Oh, Larry, I'm sorry. just take my word for it that we'll have to do something about this. So this is the false positive stop incidents. This is for low minorities. This is for high minority neighborhoods. Both of those fell, meaning predominantly white neighborhoods also benefited from the disruption of stop and frisk. But also the arrest yield increased, meaning the police are better able to stop the people who actually needed to be arrested in both cases, okay? And then this basically just summarizes the fairness conflict I just was weakened, was lessened, which is a good thing with the disruption of stop and frisk. So that's just an example of, hey, you can disrupt, these groups. And systemic discrimination, is that injustices operate not just on one person or outcome, but on interconnected complex systems, and their effects amplify as a consequence. And so when we're dealing with interdependence, we may be systematically underestimating the total inequity in the system by not accounting for that interdependence, as well as the scope for enhancing both equity and efficiency. And so when we're faced with an inequity and a mechanism that amplifies it, we can either disrupt that amplifier directly, or we can exploit it and basically implement an equity-focused intervention that uses it like as a booster engine, effectively harnessing the mechanics of systemic discrimination against itself. In other words, if I cannot do big things, I can do small things in a big way. And that's my conclusion.